Hello, welcome back to part 3 of this week's lecture. And in part 3, I want to go back to the Harry Potter novels and films. And I want to think about some of the issues of sex and gender around them specifically. And I want to talk about J.K. Rowling and her own views, particularly her transphobic comments. I'm not going to quote any of them. I'm sure you're very well aware of the way that she's been speaking about these issues and the way that other people have been reacting to that speech and the ways in which this has been debated. But I do want to talk about that in the context of our reception of these novels particularly, but also later films and subsequent cultural activity, and think about what this means for us as readers. So to go back to some of the concerns that we were talking about with Roald Dahl, the Harry Potter books have also been accused of being misogynistic. Here, for example, is a critic, Christine Scherfer, writing about what she calls Harry Potter's girl trouble. Harry's fictional realm of magic and wizardry perfectly mirrors the conventional assumption, she says, that men do and should run the world. From the beginning of the first Potter book, it is boys and men, wizards and sorcerers, who catch our attention by dominating the scenes and determining the action. Harry, of course, plays the lead in his epic struggle with the forces of darkness, the evil wizard Voldemort and his male supporters. Harry is supported by the dignified wizard Dumbledore and a colourful cast of male characters. Girls, when they're not downright silly or unlikable, are helpers, enablers and instruments, she says. No girl is brilliantly heroic the way Harry is. No woman is experienced and wise like Professor Dumbledore. Though I was impressed by Hermione's brain power, I felt sorry for her. She struggles so hard to get Harry and Ron's approval and respect, in spite of the boys' constant teasing and rejection. And she has no girl friends. Indeed, there don't seem to be any of the girls at the school worth her, or our, attention. Again and again, her emotions interfere with her intelligence, so that she loses her head when it comes to applying her knowledge. Although she casts successful spells for the boys, Hermione messes up her own, and as a result, while they go adventuring, she hides in the bathroom with cat fur on her face. I find myself wanting Hermione to shine, but her bookish knowledge and her sincere efforts can't hold a candle to Harry's flamboyant, rule-defying bravery. There's a lot more in this vein in Scherfer's article from 2000. I think it's also important to note where these texts fall in terms of the evolution over time of the Harry Potter series. Clearly earlier on we looked at one from 2005. Here is one from 2000. Over time, of course, the series developed. Characters went on unexpected arcs, new things happened to them. Some characters were written out altogether in a series of unfortunate events, shall we say. So we do need to think about when a critic wrote what they wrote. But in 2000, that was certainly Christine Scherfer's perception of the series, that it was not feminist. It was in many ways anti-feminist, and you can think about that in your own response to it. The series has also been described as homophobic. So here, for example, is Peter Tatchell speaking about what he called the outing of Dumbledore as gay. He received that in a very mixed form. It's good, he said, that children's literature includes the reality of gay people, since we exist in every society. But I am disappointed that she did not make Dumbledore's sexuality explicit in the Harry Potter book, a point which has been made often subsequently. Making it obvious would have sent a much more powerful message of understanding and acceptance. And similarly, Devon Coggan writes about the balance of depictions between the text as published at the time and J.K. Rowling's subsequent glossing of the texts since she has finished publishing them, which again has been a matter of some commentary. In behind-the-scenes dispatches from Pottermore, Devon says, the two-part play Harry Potter and the Cursed Child and the prequel film series Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, Dumbledore has popped up as a character in each. Last year's Fantastic Beasts, The Crimes of Grindelwald, centres on a complicated relationship between the power-hungry, hate-stoking Grindelwald, Johnny Depp, and a young idealistic Dumbledore, Jude Law, taking over from Richard Harris and Michael Gambon. Here is a story that gives Rowling ample opportunity to explore that passionate romantic history she revealed back in 2007. And again, that place of that revelation in the course of the developing and still ongoing history of the Harry Potter franchise is important. The chronology, the dateline, the timeline is important. And still her screenplay fails to do so. Which raises the question, does Rowling's LGBT representation really mean anything if it isn't actually represented in the text? And finally, of course, there's the more recent debate about J.K. Rowling and transphobia. Here is a tweet from MuggleNet, one of the fan sites of the Harry Potter franchise. And this is what they have to say. The Harry Potter fandom has been going strong for more than 20 years, and we are so proud to have been there alongside so many celebrating, learning and growing together. As this fandom enters its third decade, and it's worth thinking about the longevity of this series as well, we are 30 years in effectively. J.K. Rowling has chosen this time to loudly pronounce what the site calls harmful and disproven beliefs about what it means to be a transgender person. And again, note the use of italics, I think. There is a great seriousness about this debate, and there is a sharp and deeply felt anger behind these comments. In addition to the distaste we feel for her choice to publish these statements during Pride Month, as well as during a global reckoning on racial injustice, and of course the Harry Potter franchise has also encountered deep concerns about its depiction of race over the course of its history, we find the use of her influence and privilege to target marginalised people to be out of step with the message of acceptance and empowerment we find in her books and celebrated by the Harry Potter community. Although it is difficult to speak out against someone whose work we have so long admired, it would be wrong not to use our platforms to counteract the harm she has caused. Our stance is firm. Transgender women are women. Transgender men are men. Non-binary people are non-binary. Intersex people exist and should not be forced to live in the binary. We stand with Harry Potter fans in these communities, and whilst we don't condone the mistreatments JKR has received for airing her opinions about transgender people, we must reject her beliefs and so on. I haven't put the whole comment here, there's some more that you can look at if you want to do that. So these are very deeply felt issues, aren't they? And I think it's interesting to note the sense of difficulty around this. One of the things this comment makes clear is that there is an attempt to differentiate the author from her works in this case, and that fans have struggled with their attachment to the series and their personal memories of it, their personal investment in it, and the amount that it has meant to them over time, particularly through the notion of community. As I said earlier with regard to school stories, the notion of community building is really important here, and I think that the kind of Hogwarts community is no exception. That community, that building of community and the reliance that individual readers placed on the series to speak to them, to care for them, to say something to them, has really felt outraged by some of the statements that J.K. Rowling has made and the fans' reaction to them. So there's a sense that the author's individual beliefs have in some way questioned or polluted or made problematised fans' relationship with the series itself. And I think that's really quite interesting to think about. Once again, we come back to that territory of the space between the author and their text, the space between the politics of the author and the politics as encoded in their text, assuming that we can read it, which I think is also quite problematic. Look in the early section of the module, the first section of the lecture rather, I should say, at the debate about whether the series is or is not conservative. It is possible to draw sharply opposed and indeed diametrically opposed opinions from it. However, the complexity of all of this and the controversy over it, I think, shouldn't stop us debating it. They shouldn't stop us at least feeling that we can look at it. And I want to think about what this means for magic in particular. This series has been celebrated as a series about magic, a series about witches, but particularly a series about magic. There are also wizards, there's other kinds of magic, there are magical creatures. It's a magical world that Rowling has created for her characters. And clearly texts about magic, as we've been saying throughout the module, often include metaphors for real-world concerns. When you add magic, how much does it transform these? Does it obscure them? or does it illuminate them? So for some people, it's been entirely possible to get past their concerns about some of the things that both of these authors, in fact, have said or thought in the course of their lives. The magic has opened up new possibilities for them, which is not really tied to the biography of the author and their beliefs. For some readers, however, magic makes any offence worse. The Courageous Priest, for example, found the magical element of the text particularly repellent in the context of his assertion that the good guys were not good enough, even though the evil guys were clearly evil. So for some, magic lessens the connection with real-world harm. For others, that actually magnifies it. The fact this is a magical world and it doesn't have to behave in the same way as the real world means that a choice has been made to make the magical world like the real world and to replicate, therefore, its prejudices, its constrictions, its problems. That makes it worse for those readers. I think a culture war reading is often adopted as a default, but that also replicates some of the binaries that we've been discussing in the course of the module, and it might be more helpful to look, if we can, as dispassionately as possible at some of these issues and think about where we stand on a spectrum of understanding the relationship between the author's views and what goes on in the text. How are we supposed to receive that? How are we supposed to look in particular at the magical nature of the world? And does it open up new things for us, or does it make the whole thing worse when the author makes a misstep of one kind or another? I want to end on a slightly more hopeful note, I think. So drawing away a little bit from some of those complexities, perhaps, and looking at the positivities that fans have brought to this discussion. One of the ways that people have responded to the idea of magic, as I was saying in the previous slide, is to think about it as potentially transformative, to imagine it as lifting us away from those controversies and from the views of the author or authors, and transporting us to a place which is beyond those culture war considerations, the constraints of the real world. So, for example, A.J. Solomon is quoted here in Hannah Yasharoff's article, How Trans Harry Potter Fans Are Grappling with J.K. Rowling's Legacy After Her Transphobic Comments. And this is from July of this year, so it's very current. As fans move to become more critical consumers, many have found comfort in making up their own ideas about what that world, the magical world, might look like. Be it writing fan fiction for online audiences or daydreaming about how the wizarding world might be more inclusive than the real one. What would it look like to be trans with magic? Solomon sometimes wonders with fellow fans. What would transitions look like? Are there charms to make people forget your old name and pronouns? Is it something that they don't talk about because they don't need to, because it's just solved so easily? So that's one fan's take on this issue and the ways in which magic can move us beyond the idea of culture war and allow us to do something different with the text if we want to. And again, it's about a lived experience. It's about somebody still wanting to find themselves in the texts and wanting to free them from the author and possess them themselves. Really rather like Kate Pullinger's idea of co-authorship around magical texts. Finally, there's been some scholarly research about the ways in which Harry Potter readers may, and I stress this is may, in the contention of the researchers, be more liberal than previous generations have been. Now, how much that has actually got to do with other considerations, should it be the case, is a big question, I think. But in some cases, researchers have tried to tie this to the reading material of the generation, your generation, the Harry Potter books. Anthony Gazinski has said, I found empirical support, and the link is to his article on this, for the idea that the Harry Potter series influenced the political values and perspectives of the generation that came of age with these books. So actually, people slightly older than you, but you know. Reading the books correlated with greater levels of acceptance for out-groups, higher political tolerance, less predisposition to authoritarianism, greater support for equality, and greater opposition to the use of violence and torture. These were all issues that he asked his respondents to the surveys to talk about. As Harry Potter fans will have noted, these are major themes repeated throughout the series. These correlations remain significant even when applying more sophisticated statistical analyses, when controlling for, among other things, parental influence. I'm not saying Rita Skeeter like that Harry Potter helped Obama get elected, and there's a link to an article suggesting that he did, or that Harry Potter books brainwash millennials, and similarly there's another article about that, as much of the coverage of my research indicated. It's of course much more nuanced than this, and research into how we immerse ourselves in stories has demonstrated that we do not process ideas in entertainment in the same way we process information. We react on a more emotional level, at a distance from the real world. A great volume of research has been devoted to the effects of entertainment on social phenomena such as violence, sex, smoking and drinking. In this light, perhaps it doesn't seem so ridiculous to give some attention to how entertainment shapes our politics. This goes back, I think, to the idea of witchcraft as entertainment, and it perhaps also helps us think about magic. If magic is regarded as being in the realm of the not real, the potentially entertaining, the dismissible and the trivial on the one hand, but the heterotopian, the otherworldly on the other, maybe it is a place where these kind of discussions can take place, and maybe people will respond differently to a magical text than they would to a non-magical one. Now, I don't know of research focusing on that issue, but I do think it's a very interesting research question. If we couch a debate, for example, about contemporary society or politics in a magical world, if we set it in a world which isn't our own, would we come to different conclusions about that world than we would if, for example, we read a realist novel about it? What about the idea of a realist film? What about the idea of film as entertainment? What about the idea that if you have, for example, special effects in a movie, it changes your understanding of the nature of reality in that world? Do we come away from those texts with different feelings? And do they give us more hope, I suppose? And, I'd kind of love the answer to be yes, but I don't know if it is. I do think it's an interesting question, though. So for the final slide, I've given you some of these things to think about. Is there a moment in these week's books that offers you the hope of change and empowerment of a better world, if you like? There may be or there may not be. Is it a magical moment? Is that what magic does, or is it not? Does it depend on magic for its power, that text, that moment of hope, if you can find one? Please also suggest 2 or 3 other books about witches that you read as a child. I'd like to know more, and I think the group would benefit from knowing more about your reading as a child and the ways in which you framed the doll or the rolling books amongst a selection of other readings, if you did. Are there similarities in the representation of witches in those books that you read alongside, or are they not? And finally, and this is a question for next week too, why do we still like to read and watch and think about witches? What is it that is still so relevant about witchcraft and magic? What do these stories give us? I'm going to leave it there. I think I've given you quite a bit to think about this week, and I hope you'll go on and debate that in the module forum in answer to these questions, among the others. And I'll see you in the seminars.